today we're having this talk, which is looking at the art market from the perspective of the galleries, the art fairs and the auction houses. So Simon, getting back to where I started, is a director and founder of Station Gallery, which is a major Australian gallery. They have premises in Melbourne and Sydney. And Station's very active also in the international art scene, attending art fairs around the world. And Simon, his real job, I think, is running a design house and in communications. And they also have a publishing house called Artlink, which is also publishing several magazines, including Vault magazine, and a lot of art publications as well. So it's quite a vertically integrated organisation. So we're very fortunate to have his expertise for us today. Next we have Mary Wenholz, who's the Director and CEO of Melbourne Art Fair, who are responsible for running the Melbourne Art Fair. And last year they also, on behalf of NGV, also ran the Melbourne Design Fair. But she also worked extensively for Sydney Contemporary, I think, what was it, 7-8 years?
Yeah, 8.5 years, and in New South Wales it's 10 years for long service. So
and prior to that, she also was involved in art fairs in Hong Kong and in London. So she has fantastic experience with regard to the art fair world. And thirdly, we have Chris Deutscher from Deutscher and Hackett. And prior to that, he actually was a gallerist. I think it was called Deutsche Fine Art, was it?
Yep.
And then started in the auction house business with Deutsche Menzies, and had over 40 years experience in the art market, and he's also an authorised valuer for the Cultural Gifts Program, and so he's also great expertise in the market. So I think we are very fortunate and privileged to have these experts. And one of the things that we're sort of really blessed with, and I'm sort of really thankful, is that when we ask these people to speak, they actually not only do so willingly, but they also do a lot of work with the preparation of the talks for us. We don't pay them. We see them as sort of making a contribution to the public with regard to expanding our appreciation of what's happening in the art world. So we're greatly thankful for that. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off one by one. So firstly, Simon's going to start off, and
I'm showing my age, old school, bit of paper. Good turn up, Chris, and Mary, thank you, and Charles. Thanks for having me. I've been involved in the art world since probably the age of 15, so I've seen a lot of it. My mother was an artist taught by John Brackett, the NGV school back in the day. She gave me a subscription to Art in Australia back in '82, thereabouts. So I was sort of raised on Booth and De Villa and Gascoigne and those sort of wonderful artists back in the day. Panicked. Went to art school and then panicked, was worried that I wasn't going to be able to pay the rent. So I jumped over to graphic design, sold a piece of my soul, and became a graphic designer and managed to get a job. However, the bug of art was in my veins, and I thought about it every day. I actually spoke to my father back in the 80s about opening a gallery one day, and he thought I had rocks in my head. But actually his advice was, well, if you're going to open a gallery, you should sell Chinese art. I reckon there's a market there one day, son. Well, you never know. We've been showing in Hong Kong recently, and I see opportunities in China as well in the near future. So a little bit about Station. We started in 2011 in Melbourne, in South Yarra, around the corner. And we opened our Sydney gallery in 2019, now located in Surrey Hills. We represent both Australian and international artists. We run an exhibition program that includes up to 24 exhibitions a year and participate in 2 to 3 local and international art fairs. So you're around 4, 5 or 6 a year, depending on the cycle. Station has developed and a gallery that represents a diverse group of artists. And that's really the starting point. It's very important, the type of artists that we like to work with. We look for artists that are culturally, politically, or visually relevant. Artists that explore the human condition. Artists that are career-oriented, determined and ambitious in their practices. So artists are our primary concern and are the foundation of the gallery's ongoing success. Excuse my fading voice, but it's been a busy couple of weeks for me. So we've developed a gallery model to survive over the last 15 years. And actually, it took us 8 years to break even. I believe galleries need to be able to continually support and invest in practice of emerging and established artists. We can't, when you start a gallery, the most, I suppose, commercially successful artists are doing well. They've got no reason to move and join a starting gallery. So you've got to start from the bottom and work up. So you've got to develop a team. You need, of course, you need balance in a gallery. You need diversity. You need to give artists time to develop. Our goal is for all of our artists to become full-time career artists. And it's a terrific thrill when we work with an artist who's had to subsidise their practice with various jobs to give those away and just be sustainable on their own practice. That's a wonderful thing to watch. Our exhibition program consumes around 30% of our time. Those 24 exhibitions a year, a lot of them across the 2 spaces. The remainder of the time is focused on artist institutional projects, art fairs, public art commissions, grant applications for research, travel residencies, publishing projects, and other domestic and international opportunities. And of course, the generation of sales. Some interesting stats have come up recently. I was just speaking to Chris about them from the recent UBS Art Market Report. One of the graphs that caught my mind was, okay, UBS have reported global sales declined in 2024 by 12%, which is a huge amount. However, the statistic that I really liked was transactions grew by 3%. So we've dropped by 12, we've increased transactions by 3%. So reflecting an increase in the lower priced items. Now this is on a global scale. So I think this is good news for Australian galleries because most of the Australian galleries actually fit into, let's call it the lower priced on international markets. There is no denying that our local market is very, very small. We all know that. I think everyone knew each other in this room, and there was a great conversation had when I went 5 minutes ago. And I think this is mostly a product of our geography. Effectively, we haven't connected to that international market. We're basically isolated and become a bit of a bubble market in our own bubble. So bridging the gap is our big challenge for our gallery and for our artists. We need to reach these international markets in order to raise our artist values. So, question, how are we going to do it? We believe international art fairs are one of the ways to achieve this. Over the past few years, we've made a commitment to participate in some of Asia's most important fairs, such as Art Basel Hong Kong, Frieze Seoul, and Art Singapore. A number of our peers have suggested, crazy, why are you doing it? Why are you selling your good stock to barely break even? You know, I could take those works that I'm selling and sell them in the gallery, no problem. But what I'm not doing is developing our market for the future. So I keep going back to the long game. So what we're doing is to present opportunities for our artists focused on the long game. For example, after presenting at Hong Kong last year, one of our artists will now be showing with a highly regarded international gallery later this year. It's those little wins that are making all the difference for us. We've secured the acquisition of many works to international collections, both institutional and private. We've just recently secured a sale for an international institution, and there'll be a little bit of time before it's completely signed off, but it's those types of sales and those types of interactions that are going to make the difference long term. But it's difficult. You know, we've got rising freight costs, geopolitical tensions, economic volatility, diminished value of our AUD. So just as an example, if I do the Hong Kong Art Fair and I'm doing it on the cheap, that'll cost me about $150,000 fixed price. So straight up, I've got to sell $300,000 to break even. So on call, I've got to find $300,000 worth of stock. As I said, this is the break even. So that's the major hurdle for us all. Locally, we know the markets are slow at the moment. However, we have not seen a decrease in the higher end sales, which is interesting. But works must be museum quality. That's what the high end museums want. That's what the collectors want. Collectors are savvy. You guys are savvy. You can easily do your research. A quick Google provides access to all sorts of information, exhibition stock available, prices, other achievements, etc. So, but it has to be a special work to sell at the top end. So I'm sure all of you and the ones in the game have experienced that. The future growth markets for station are clearly international. The AUD, the Aussie dollar, is good buying for the US and UK markets. International collectors are starting to look at the Australian markets and seeing Australian artists as exciting and an accessible opportunity. I think it's quite obvious that our First Nations people are leading the way in this area. Look at what's happening in New York, the Tate at the moment. Emily's got a show, it's just open or about to open in London. Sally Gabori's flying. I think, you know, the great historians out of New York see a lot of these First Nations artists as, you know, the missing chapter of the history of modern art. So we're actively developing relationships and collaborating with peer galleries and around the world. And we're curating their artists and hoping to curate our artists into their galleries to expand audiences. We're working together to place works into reciprocal institutions. We're setting singular goals and outcomes, and we're starting to see results from this work. So, really, to summarise, all in all, I'm very positive about the future of the Australian art market. Our market is clearly very undervalued. We just need to let the world know that we're here and we can match it with the best in the world. Thank you.
Good evening, my name's Mary Wenholz. I'm the CEO of Melbourne Art Foundation, which you would know Melbourne Art Fair as our primary event. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about art fairs, looking very specifically at Melbourne Art Fair and how it operates within the market that we have here. And I thought I'd start by going back to the start, because I think this provides a really lovely context to what I'll be talking about further on. So Melbourne Art Fair started its life in 1988 as the Australian Contemporary Art Fair. It was timed to coincide with the bicentennial celebrations, and it was started by a group of gallerists who saw what was happening on the international market with art fairs and decided to create their own one in Melbourne. It took place at the Royal Exhibition Building on the balcony level above a tractor show. And that was the inaugural start to art fairs in Australia. It happened every 2 years, and in 2000 it was renamed as Melbourne Art Fair in recognition of the trend within the international market for art fairs to be named after the cities in which they're held. In 2003, the Melbourne Art Fair at that point had been delivered by the Australian Commercial Gallery Association, which was a group of commercial galleries that came together to do the Melbourne Art Fair. In 2003, they formed the Melbourne Art Foundation. And that decision was driven by the fact, I was speaking to a former chair, I know I have another former chair in the audience tonight, but Christopher Hodges, who was on the board at the time then, and he said that the decision to form the Melbourne Art Foundation to deliver the Melbourne Art Fair was made because the focus for galleries doing fairs is sales, but the focus for an art fair is market development. And they thought it was important to have an independent group running the fair to really drive that focus of art market development. In 2009, the ACGA and Melbourne Art Fair formally separated, so now the art fair is solely delivered by the Melbourne Art Foundation. The next two chapters I included because I think they really reflect changes in the market and how the Melbourne Art Fair is responding to those changes. The first, it was that in 2020, the Melbourne Art Fair tried to move to the convention centre. COVID happened, so it actually took place in 2022. But that was a move from the REB to the convention centre in an acknowledgement of the fact that while the convention centre may not have the glamour and the history of the REB, it provides a space that is in keeping with where international art fairs largely take place. The other important change that happened was in 2024, the fair moved to an annual format. And that is in keeping with most fairs around the world. There has been a shift, I think, in life in general. We live at a much faster pace now. And so a fair taking place every 2 years, you are forgotten, really. And the market demanded for it to be on an annual basis. The next image is from that very inaugural fair. So that's Bloomfield Gallery showing on the balcony level. I've been going through all the archives photos. They're amazing. I only picked one to share tonight, but this is where we started. The first image I showed is where we are now. So that sort of shows that trajectory of what I was talking about. So this here, I won't go through it all. I don't want it to be absolutely boring, but this shows really where Melbourne Art Fair sits, what our ethos is, what we're focused on doing. And as you can see, we're a tightly curated fair. We're focused on presenting the best of the best within a considered environment. We are committed to profiling Australian galleries and Australian artists and supporting the important conversations of our time within that art market. These here, again, I won't go through them all, but these are the 5 pillars that lead our strategic priorities. And as they all tie back to that idea of supporting market development and building audiences and ensuring that everything that the fair is doing is tying back to these principles. So, building sustainable careers for artists. Melbourne Art Foundation's remit is to support living artists through the development of markets and audiences. And these are some really interesting statistics around what Melbourne Art Foundation through Melbourne Art Fair has been able to achieve since 2003 to the present. We have seen artwork sales of over $80 million in that time, that has been galleries selling largely Australian art to largely Australian audiences. More importantly, I think, demonstrating the power of an art fair, we've had an economic impact of over $300 million to the state of Victoria's economy. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about these next 2 points. We have paid over $1.2 million in grants and fees and commissions to artists and curators through the Foundation's programs, and we've supported the 12 institutional acquisitions of new works into their collections. These are some little stats here that I've pulled out just around that $80 million figure of artwork sales, showing the growth in sales across that time. Now, I'm sure Simon will agree with this. This does give a little bit of a false picture in that it shows per gallery. Not every gallery walks away with that amount of money at the end of the fair. They would all love to, but it shows that's the average across gallery participation in the fair. Galleries pay a huge amount of money to do fairs beyond just the booth costs, but the sales that can be generated in that 4-day period can be incredible for the artists and the galleries that are doing that. So building markets and audiences. This here is a pyramid that looks at what that visitor art market demographic looks like. At the top, you've got the collectors, you've got buyers, you've got industry, and you've got art-loving public. And everyone tends to focus on the pointy end of the pyramid in terms of what the art market is. But one of the things I find really interesting about that pyramid is the most recent fair, we had about 17,000 people attend. 30% of the visitors, so that's about 12,000 people when you take out the VIPs, about 12,000 people came, and of that 12,000, they said, we're coming to the fair to look to buy art. And I think it shows the power of art fairs to bring an audience that isn't necessarily already connected with galleries and visiting galleries to be buying work. These are some other statistics that I've pulled out from the economics impact study that was done on the fair for the 2005 fair. And what I find particularly interesting in this is looking at the demographic that attends the art fair. So the visitor demographic skews younger, it's largely female, and it's largely aged 25 to 35, 40. The VIP demographic skews older, as you would expect, more established collectors attending the fair. I think it's really interesting to see the way an art fair can draw such a broad audience into its orbit. It's not one particular demographic that you're attracting, it's actually a representative of the wider society, and the job of the fair is to be bringing those people in and connecting them with the galleries if they're not already doing so. And I think one of the real things I focus on with Melbourne Art Fair is making people realise that for what they're paying for something that is decorative, IKEA-produced art, they can get amazing original work by Australian artists where they're actually supporting the cultural production of the times that we'll be remembered by. And that's what I always come back to. I know this talk started around the idea of investment, but I think the purchasing of art from living artists is a way of ensuring the way our times are understood by future generations. And that, for me, is one of the most important things that you can be doing. So, Melbourne Art Foundation. What is interesting about the fair is not only are we one of the oldest fairs in the world, but we're owned by and run by a not-for-profit foundation. And what that means is not that I have this amazing philanthropic bequest that I just get to sit with and spend a bit of money. What it means is that any money that we make at Melbourne Art Fair, which is our main vehicle, we reinvest back into the arts ecology. And we do this through certain programs at the fair. And they're all focused on how we can support a diverse and engaged arts ecology. And what I mean by that is these different components pull on different threads that make up the art market. So the first is the Young Gallery Initiative. So this initiative supports the participation of galleries that are aged less than 7 years of age with a 40% subsidy on their booth costs. And what that recognises is the importance of supporting that next generation of gallerists and artists participate in the fair, because if we don't support them, we don't have the galleries of tomorrow. And what we really importantly do at the Melbourne Art Fair is we don't show you who those galleries are. We put young galleries next to established galleries. We make a very democratic floor plan so that hopefully you can walk in and meet someone that you haven't met before and support what they're doing. There was a young gallery that did the fair this year that they took a tiny little booth. They weren't sure that they were going to be able to actually afford it. They scraped the money together. They had a fantastic fair, and it has introduced them to an entire new group of collectors. They've now moved from a tiny little shop above, I think, a lawyer's office into a gallery. Sorry, I just broke the controller, but I can fix it in a little bit. And so it just shows the way that a fair, what that did to position that gallery in people's understanding of how they fit within that ecology was really important. Another thing we do is the project rooms. So that is, we support the participation of 2 not-for-profit independent arts organisations, REs, things like that, to have a presence at the fair with non-commercial outcomes. Basically what that means is we work with spaces like ACE in Adelaide, which is we've got an image of here. We've worked with Gertrude Street, First Draft, all these different organisations. We give them a booth at the fair and we give them some money so that they can afford to participate, and they present projects that don't necessarily result in sales. Sometimes they do result in sales, and sometimes that's incredibly confusing for those spaces that are not used to selling. They had one of the spaces that did the fair this year sold a work and had someone come to pick it up from their space in Collingwood, and the person arrived and said, "Sorry, I can't remember what I've bought." And they were horrified. They're like, "You spent $2,000 and you can't remember what you bought." Like, it was this whole different world to be operating in. The year prior, a space from Sydney sold a work, and they called me on Sunday night terrified because they didn't know what they were meant to do now, because the person had paid but they weren't quite sure how to get the work to them. And so it is really interesting to see these different worlds clashing together and to be supporting that. Another thing we do is the William Morritt Indigenous Arts Centre program. So with that program, we support the participation of 4 Aboriginal-owned art centres from remote regional areas to take a booth at the fair. We give them a fully subsidised booth and a grant towards production and travel costs so that they can present the work of their artists within an international fair in terms of the audience that's engaging with it. And one of the really important principles around that idea is that we have seen those artists then get picked up by commercial galleries that are doing the fair. So we're directly supporting those communities and those artists that are participating. We then have curated programs like the video program and the Beyond program, which are very much focused on moving beyond the booth in terms of the works that are being presented. We have talks and tours and workshops which are very focused on educational outcomes, with making people feel comfortable about going into booths and talking to people and asking questions and breaking down those barriers. And then we have our commission program. So the commission program is really the jewel in the crown of all that Melbourne Art Foundation does through the Melbourne Art Fair. This is a list of the 12 commissions that have been achieved since 2006. And with each of these, Melbourne Art Foundation has partnered with an institution, with both organisations contributing funds to the creation of a new work that premieres at Melbourne Art Fair and then goes into the collection of that institution. And when you look through the list of names of both the institutions and the artists, it's an amazing snapshot of the last 20 odd years. I won't go into too much detail because I am spilling some beans that I'm not meant to spill, but at the 2026 fair, we're looking at restaging one of these commissions, bringing it back to the fair to show audiences that trajectory of what the Foundation Commission program has done. So just some images of some of the commissions, because enough of me just endlessly talking, that's way more boring than looking at art. So these are some of the ones that have happened. So this was Melbourne Art Fair in 2018, which was the edition that took place in the tent near Akka. This is one going back to, this was 2008 with David Griggs's tent. That went into the collection of Gallery of Modern Art Brisbane. This was one of the first video commissions that we did in partnership with ACME, and this was Kayleen Whiskey. The commission for 2026 is another video commission. It's interesting looking at what the foundation is doing with the commission program in terms that it's not just focused on local artists and local content. In 2025, for the first time, we actually partnered with an international institution, and that we worked with Govert Brewster Gallery on the work on supporting the production of a work by Yona Lee that was premiered at Melbourne Art Fair and then went into an exhibition at Govert Brewster. And the work was designed so it could be reconfigured and fit within both spaces. And again, to touch back on what Simon mentioned earlier, a really important role that galleries and fairs play is creating opportunity for dialogue between different markets. We don't operate by ourselves here in Australia. Sometimes it feels like we do, but it is so important to be constantly making those connections, whether it be participating in fairs or bringing curators out here. And that's something that we do at the Melbourne Art Fair, is that we recognise that we are very far from the rest of the world. And for the international galleries participating in the fair, there is a huge risk there, but we still want to have that international connection. So we bring international curators out, we include them in the talks program. And one thing I'm really keen to see happen with future editions of the fair is actually have it so those curators come out and then they do studio visits and they connect with artists outside of the fair environment, because what you then see happening is those artists get included in international exhibitions and international programs. And so I think the fair plays this really important role in being a conduit to opening up and creating additional opportunities. Then this was the one in 2024. So this was Julie Rapp, and it was done in partnership with the Art Gallery of Western Australia. This work was called Somos, Standing on My Own Shoulders, and it was 2 life-size bronze casts of Julie Rapp standing on her own shoulders. Julie said when she saw it at the fair, you really do look a lot more littler when you're in bronze. And this was a work she'd wanted to make for about 30 years, and she had just never had the chance to do it. So to see this be realised by one of an incredibly significant feminist artist in Australia produced this work, and for it then it went to the MCA in Sydney as part of her retrospective exhibition there, and then when it's now on its way to Western Australia, it's going to be installed on the terrace out the front of the gallery. So again, showing that kind of arc in the lifespan of a work and what happens when you have that institutional engagement. Simon touched on this, so I won't go into too much detail, but one thing I wanted to give as I round out this talk, we've talked about what the fair can do in terms of generating sales, what it can do for the local economy, what it can do for the arts ecology of a region, but one thing that is really important to take into consideration when you talk about art fairs and the market is what it is for galleries to participate. So in terms of the participation process, just to give a quick nutshell summary, galleries approach the fair, will have an application process, they'll put forward a proposal, that proposal goes before a selection committee and is reviewed against the selection criteria for that particular fair. The galleries then pay for their booth. So their booth will come with walls, lights, a marketing package, that kind of thing. That's just to get to the fair in terms of the cost, and that can cost between $5,000 and $100,000 depending on the fair and the size of your booth. But the galleries then have to cover the cost of transportation, of staffing, of travel costs, of feeding their staff while they're at the fair, and all these other things. So for a gallery, they're looking at up to $150,000 to do a fair. It's a huge investment, and it is the role of the fair to make sure that it's achieving the outcomes that support that investment in the fair. The outcomes that the galleries achieve through fair participation, the most obvious is selling works to new and existing clients. But the other really important part of fair participation, which again Simon touched on in a really lovely way, was you're showing your artist's work within a broader regional global context and connecting with broader networks. Recently, Artsy did an article talking about art fairs, and it was titled How Much Art Fairs Really Cost According to Small Galleries. And there was two particular quotes that I wanted to pull out of that as I finish out my presentation tonight. The first, both of them were international galleries talking about doing international fairs in markets outside of where they normally exhibit. And the first quote really sums up beautifully what comes from doing a fair. It's not just the selling of the work, but it's the connections that you make. It's the opportunities that grow through doing that. But at what cost does that come to? And as this person says here, we almost always go into a minus after participating in an art fair event because of the costs that are involved. It is a real gamble for galleries to be doing fairs, and it's something that has become increasingly important to the art market. We now live in a time when everyone's time poor. Art fairs may not be the best way to see art, but it is the best way to see all the art of that moment. You get an amazing overview of trends, of what artists are doing, what galleries are doing through fair participation. And so I think art fairs, everyone questions why they exist, if they need to exist, and I think you just have to attend an art fair and see the energy in the room and see the conversations that are happening to know that art fairs very much do exist and need to exist. How they exist into the future as we respond to changes in this market, I think are an interesting point to think about, and it's something that working at Melbourne Art Foundation, where my remit is bigger than just delivering the fair. It's looking at how we support our art market here, and it's something that I constantly come back to with each edition of the fair, thinking about what goals are we trying to achieve for the galleries, what connections are we trying to make for the collectors, what is it that the fair is contributing to the local arts ecology and the local art economy. Thank you.
Big and confident. That's our market on the right. I've actually pumped it up a bit because we're in Australian dollars on the right and American on the left. So you wouldn't see it if it was Australian dollars. So that's sort of a time spread for me. I've been in this industry, rather than game, for 50 years. I know it doesn't look like it. I started in shorts. It's been a long time, and it's been a great journey, and it's almost been 50% primary gallery and 50% auction houses.
And when I started in 1975, I had come from London. I had met, coincidentally, dealers and conservation people in London, and I thought, oh, I'm just going to start an art gallery back in Melbourne. I had no idea really of what I was doing. I sort of had a feeling for it. My art teacher at school, Ian Bowe at Haileybury College, was really inspirational. And I sort of just had this thing about doing something with art. So in London, I met lots of dealers, went to lots of parties and openings, and I just got this art gallery thing. So I came back and rented a shop in High Street, Armidale, and started what was called Deutsche Galleries. Without the C in the Deutsche, then that's another story. And my first exhibition, looking back on it, wasn't bad. I had a big Brett Whiteley that I bought for $6,000 and sold for $7,000. I just thought that was fantastic. How good's this? It was sold 6 months ago for $2 million. My dad always said I just should have stayed on an island and not got into this game with that first exhibition. And I had a massive John Glover that's now in the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. And interesting then, a bit different to now, the public galleries are quite active, so I became a bit of a sort of sniffing out person for the National Gallery of Australia, Daniel Thomas and James Mollison. They had a big budget to fill and they had deadlines to spend money, and Chris, can you come to Canberra? We need to spend blah, blah, by June the 30th. It was a different world, and Ron Radford at Ballarat sold him a lot of things, and then when we went to Adelaide, I sold him a lot of things. So it was relationships, very close relationships with directors and curators that sort of kept me afloat, if you like, throughout those years. And I finally got through with confidence into the mid-80s. And that was a crazy era. There was a big boom for traditional pictures bought by WA entrepreneurs. So people like Holmes Accord, Alan Bond, Laurie Connell, Yossi Goldberg, all those people, Rick Stowe, were selling a lot of art to. Everything I got in Melbourne went to Perth, everything. Bill Hughes. So in 1985, I was involved in this sale, as a few people were, to Bill Hughes of Golden Summer for $1 million. And that was the first $1 million sale in Australia. And Bill then lent it to the National Gallery of Australia, and then some years later they bought it for $3.5 million. So at that time there were no computers. The whole thing was letters. Bizarre, isn't it? And when the computer came in, it wasn't a case of the net that we've got available now. It was a case of paying somebody to design a program with MS-DOS and all this crazy stuff I couldn't understand. We basically got our database up on the computer, and we didn't have to hand write or hand type so many things. So it sort of translated, I suppose, into a more streamlined system of monitoring a database. And one of the biggest and most valuable things we own today is our database. So then, at the late 90s, late 80s, I kept creeping up in chronology. I was handling colonial works, impressionist works, modern works, more modern works, more modern works. So I'd ended up sort of going from handling artists like John Brack through to artists like Richard Larder and even John Nixon. So it all moved quite quickly. And I went to New York in 1990 and I saw these spectacular galleries, and I got a little bit too big for my boots and thought, I'll open a second gallery. I'll have a secondary gallery and a primary gallery. So we opened a gallery called Deutsche Brunswick Street. And at that time I showed artists like Bill Henson and Peter Booth, and that then shifted on to John Brack and John Olsen and a few of those sorts of artists. And by 1990, I had two galleries going. Interest rates were 23%. The bank had given me a lot of money to do what I did with stock and all this sort of optimistic viewpoint I had. And then there was a market crash, and that was a very tough time. And it was almost a time of selling my property, which we'd spent a fortune on, borrowed a lot of money on, and then sort of regrouping in Melbourne with a much more sustainable model, which was closer to our demographic and blah, blah. So artists like John Brack and John Olsen and Bill Henson and Peter Booth all came along for that ride, and it was fantastic. But every time you'd have a Booth show or a Brack show or a Henson show or a Tim Storia show, you'd sell one work. That was it, one. And two would be fantastic, So the 90s were a real struggle. And I met quite an eccentric collector called Rod Menzies in the mid-90s, and he started buying John Bracks and John Bracks and John Bracks. He sort of had a thing for multiple examples by artists like Jeff Smart and John Brack. And he said, "Oh, Chrissy, I've got a great idea." And I said, "Oh, what is it?" He said, "I'm taking you to lunch tomorrow." I said, "Fine." So we went to lunch and we drank so much wine I'd forgotten what the lunch was all about at the end. And I said, "Oh, Rod, what was that great idea?" And he said, "We're going to open another auction house." And I said, "You are mad." I said, "You've got Christie's, you've got Sotheby's, you've got Joel's. We need to get rid of an auction house, not add another auction house." And he said, "What would make you do it?" And I said, "Well, pay out all my debt, pay me a fantastic salary and give me business equity and I'll do it." And we shook hands and we did it. And then I went, "Oh my God, how am I going to put this first auction together?" So anyhow, in the year 1998, we had our first auction and it was moderately successful, and we persevered and we built up, and Deutscher and Hackett joined the business, and we had some great people. And Rod was a very difficult guy to deal with. His cleaning business thrived when he was moved to the art business because he wasn't so involved in messing up all their deals. But he was very involved, a very difficult guy to deal with, in fact, unbearable. But I thank him sincerely. He's no longer with us, but I thank him sincerely for that opportunity. So in 2007, David and I had enough, and we just thought we'll start our own business, and court cases and all that sort of stuff, and we started our own business. And I think the core of the business carried through those clients I dealt with in the 80s and 90s. There was a loyalty factor, and we've kept the business going and growing. And interestingly, sort of by now, we're starting to see a lot of those collections come to our auctions. So here I am after 50 years wanting to retire, and I can't retire because we're getting busier and busier. It's sort of crazy, so I've given up on the retirement model, much to my wife's disappointment. And we have a lot of clients now. I have a lot of clients in their mid-90s, and they're planning their future, and I do feel an obligation to them, and it sort of does your head in, because on the one hand you want the business, and on the other hand you want the client. So there is that oddity of people ageing and planning their future and their collections, and some people sell before they die because they want their children to not to muck it up and to give them the money rather than the art. So moving on to global sales, that's a sort of 57 billion. That's sort of how it's made up. Interestingly though, even though Christie's and Sotheby's get this enormous publicity from their publicity machines, there's still only 12 billion of 57 billion. So it's not the whole deal. The whole deal's made up of dealers like Simon, and it's made up of private sales and secondary market, and then the auctions are next. And then the one thing that's changed dramatically since COVID, 2019, is online sales. So the sales of these big guys have dropped dramatically at the top end, like 40% of their top end sales have vanished in the last couple of years, but they're pumping up their private sales, which we have to some degree, and they're also getting into sort of handbags and frocks and all that market. So they are actually feeling all the time for new business and for new opportunities, and it's ruthlessly commercial. And my prediction is that one of Sotheby's and Christie's will probably have to go, because they keep driving the deals to no money to compete. So there's this thing of prestige, selling hundreds of millions of dollars worth of collections to win the prestige to be number one. But they're giving away so much margin, they're having third-party involvements with guarantees left, right and centre, and the margins are woeful and the risk's very high. So the highest price at auction last year was this amount here. Siri, extend that by 2 minutes. That's a fall in a high value sale. Yeah, so this is a lowish amount for what's been happening with, you know, Modigliani and the Da Vinci picture at 450 million. And then that's the equivalent Australian thing, which proudly we were responsible for, and that's a very high amount in the context of Australian art. A high amount in the context of international art is 100 million. And if we're looking at the whole global turnover thing, that's a pretty flat thing. It's got its ups and downs, but 57 billion sort of where it's at now. And if we break, this is interesting, I don't know the answer to this, but I'm guessing that the Australian market's around 450 million. I'd love to hear from others on this. Auction sales we know were 136,000, that's a fact. Dealers, we know that art fairs are around that amount, stand to be corrected. My guess is dealer sales, having a feel for galleries that might turn over 1 million or 5 million, adding them all up, it sort of comes to that sort of zone. And the biggie is the Indigenous thing, which is a very tall guy with galleries in Australia and America, is just doing a brilliant job pushing this Indigenous market around the world, and he's really pushing it hard. So I can see the Indigenous thing doubling in the next couple of years, and it really should double in the next couple of years. This is a really basic thing, but most galleries, and I think Simon will agree, have around about 40 artists in their stable, and the smaller galleries have less, 20 odd, and the bigger galleries have up to 50 or 60. So this is a sort of food chain, if you like, from our perspective. It begins with Simon and his gallery and primary sales, and they're just a few of the considerations, I think, to make the whole thing work. The quality of the artists, the quality of the clients, how you network at exhibitions and then marketing, which can be the art fair. And then collectors split between private and institutional, local, overseas. And then there's another whole show here, the reasons for people collecting art. Like lower value art, it's more the millennial group, and they are buying from the heart. When it gets to the top end, it becomes quite ruthless. It's very, very sort of calculated, status symbol. We sell a lot of valuable art to Sydney people, often first off buyers. Harbourside homes, prestige pictures, and clients or friends will go there and say, wow, you've got a Jeff Smart, oh, Fred Williams. You're clever, and it sort of, it builds them up. They can't really go out there with a printout of their stock market holdings or something and say, oh, have a look at this. It's not very exciting. But walking around the house, it's a conversation, and I think it sort of catches on at that top end. It's something else you can do with your money. And then it gets to a point, and this is where we come in, where collectors have to sell. They die, they're old and they want to sell, or their children want to sell while they're old. We have a lot of conversations with children. Or people downsize, or they run out of space, or their taste changes, or they might need some money, which is one of the lesser reasons for people selling art. Or they decide to gift the work to the family because it's not worth anything, or gift it to a public gallery and maybe get a tax advantage. And we sort of fit into that top box there, and we're a little bit in the bottom box with private sales. Like our private sales are around about 30-40% of our auction sales. There we are. I'm really proud of our team. they're, like, it's great, this is why I keep doing this, it's great to be surrounded by young, keen people, and 4 of us have got these older dealing backgrounds. 3 of us have worked at Christie's and Sotheby's, and then 10 have Bachelor of Arts degrees, and with 4 with Masters of Arts degrees, and 2 worked in public galleries. So it's a really good mix of people, and they're, like, the one thing that ties it all together is a passion for art. That's why we're all here, and that's why we're doing it. Like, it might sound like money, but it's more art. And they're great people, they're really, really good team. And, you know, very equally dominated by women and men. And they're our sales. Like, you can see, it's a growing business. We had a freakish year a few years back. I think we sold NAB Collection and C-Bus in the same year. But typically, it's a really wacky business model. We have 3 or 4 auctions a year, 3 or 4 income events a year that last for 90 minutes. So it's a bit nerve-wracking that you wait for 4 months before a cent comes in, and then 90 minutes, and you sit there and you think, hang on, it's actually the next 30 minutes going to make or break the business. And I always feel we're as good as our last auction, so there's always pressure on to just keep it up. Some of our past vendors, public institutions and prestigious institutions, and recently, very happy to say, it's a bit like Simon's story, Museum of Modern Art New York have consigned something to our August auction. So that means, you know, we're very well connected with institutions overseas, and then some private higher status sales there. Sometimes I feel like we're working for the government. We spend a lot of time helping with loans to exhibitions and publications and images, and introducing galleries to people that own things. So all of these galleries, like with Carrick Fox shows or Robert shows or Russell shows or Streetman shows, they're all contacting us for past sales and can we put them onto the, you know, so we almost need a full-time person doing this. And then we do a lot of valuations for public institutions with gifts. And then I feel like we're a government collection service. So we're continually passing on collecting copyright fees, and we don't get any margin for this. We're continually collecting resale royalty fees. I think that'd be a really good one for Charles to pursue, the resale royalty one, because that started with the whole idea of an Indigenous artist, Johnny Warren Goulis, selling a work for $200 in Alice Springs, and it goes for $480,000 at Sotheby's, and Johnny Warren Gouldy got his $200 and someone else gets a 500 odd. It started with that, but it's all out of skew because most of the money goes to Wendy Whiteley, Helen Brack and Lynn Williams. Like, they don't need the money. The guys that need the money are the Indigenous communities. And even the Indigenous sales, a lot of the money doesn't get through because they can't find the people anymore because they've died. So that whole thing is really flawed. Anyway, we've passed on $1 million odd to Wendy and Lynn and Helen. And then just finally, this art market report's fantastic. It's 260 pages worth of very in-depth statistical analysis of the market. And most of the markets in America, UK, China. Australia doesn't rate there, it's 0.5%. So it'd be a very thin sliver, as we saw at the beginning. And then I thought that's interesting. Half the dealers, and Simon sort of touched on this enthusiastically, half the dealers for half the turnover would be less than $500,000 a year. So the international turnover is made up more with little sales than big sales. And then this brings in the art fair thing as well. This is from an overseas perspective. You can understand why American or European dealers need to travel a lot with art fairs. It's a big way of exposing their business. But it's much more expensive, as Simon said, to do from Australia. But it is interesting, that's outside of overheads like rent and wages, how the art fair component's the biggest one for an international dealer, and then packing and shipping. Travel and accommodation, Simon's got that down much lower than that. So I think I'm done. Thank you very much.